Sometimes I like to like try and work in some kind of quote with the movie, but I can't remember. I didn't write down any quotes this time.
Oh, I have a
don't
quote.
remember
I
any.
have a favorite quote.
Hit me, yeah.
Digging to meet the dead, which sounds really morbid, but it's also really true.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's exactly it. Hello, and welcome to Movies We Dig, the podcast where we talk about film, antiquity, and everything in between. I'm Colin McCormick.
And I'm Elijah Fleming.
And today we're joined by another special guest we're really excited about. We're here with Dr. Christie Vogler, who is currently the assistant professor of history at the University of Lynchburg, and she is the co-director of the Ganjavecchio Archaeological Project. So, Christie, wonderful to have you.
Yeah, it's really nice to be here. I'm excited to talk about this movie today.
I'm excited too, because this is, even though our podcast is ostensibly Movies We Dig, this is really our first like actual archaeological movie. That's mostly my fault for just sort of.
I think it's the film industry's fault. I argue that this is like one of the first films really about archaeology that exists. And
Indiana Jones doesn't count.
Okay, I said that to Nick, and he's like, "What about Indiana Jones?" And I'm like, "Does Indiana Jones dig a hole ever?"
And we were talking about that. I think I was talking about this with Tracy, my partner, and or maybe it was you, Eli. I'm trying to remember who I was talking, because there's only like three people I talked to.
The Egyptians were digging the hole for him.
Yeah, he gets like a bunch of locals to dig the hole for him, which I guess also kind of happens in this movie. But
yeah, I mean, that's the history of archaeology, especially during this time period. It starts off as a really exploitive practice where so many unnamed individuals who are actually doing the digging never get mentioned by name. So what's like one thing that's really interesting is probably one of the first scientific excavations conducted was in the United States by Thomas Jefferson. You probably never realized he was an archaeologist. And
he was everything, right? He is like, he like teaches himself French and botany and paleontology. And...
Yep. And he was interested in excavating the mounds from a cultural group known as the Mound Builders at the time. But the actual people excavating those mounds were his slaves. So some of the earliest diggers are nameless.
Of course.
I just, if you look, and they kind of have it a little bit in this movie, but if you see like photographs of like old archaeological digs, particularly in places like Athens or in Egypt or something like that, there's always like the archaeologist who's there in like I'm thinking of like Arthur Evans or a guy like that, like standing there in kind of like a perfectly white suit while there's like all these people just, with spades and shovels all around him. But yeah, I guess we can start. We'll start with our guest first, but because this is obviously also a new movie, which is another first for us. But Christie, how do you dig this movie?
Yeah, I so dig this movie. I think I have a friend group with Laj where we met at Ganjavecchio on a dig together, and I have another friend who also worked on the dig. And I think I was the first in our friend group to come across the preview for the dig that I shared with everyone. And I must have watched it like 5 to 10 times before it finally came out, and I teared up every single time because just the preview of like seeing archaeology depicted in a realistic way and then getting the emotion right. Like, why do we dig? Like, why do we take on bad pay, hard labor? What is the point? And
£2 a week or whatever it was.
Oh yeah, no. And I think even as a grad student, you're paying people to have the pleasure to go and dig, and it's like there must be something to it that really speaks to you, that you're willing to put up with all of that. And I think the movie caught that really well with the character of Basil.
I agree. Yeah, I also really dig this movie, and I think it made me feel a lot of feels about our field, and especially having not been in the field this past summer, and how for so many of us that was really such a devastating blow. And then all of the excitement and the atmosphere of this movie, really brought out all of those feelings for me. So for sure. I dig it.
Yeah, no, it wasn't even just all the positive feelings you get from digging. It's also like the negative and like I'm going to use so many curse words right now because something
That's
that
okay. Yeah, I think I bleed out the F bomb, but that's
okay.
about it, and that's usually about as bad as we get.
Okay. Archaeology, we drop all of the F bombs and other words because I think like the first visceral reaction I had in the movie is when they find just a piece of wood, like a
Mhm.
board, and they're like, okay, we're gonna lift it on three. And they go to pick it up and it crumbles. And like to
Yeah,
me, I felt that like there's
yeah.
been so many moments where something that lasted for thousands of years just crumbles in your hand. And
Have you? I suppose I maybe you shouldn't. We shouldn't ask, but have you ever like broken anything?
oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
You can't help it sometimes.
Oh wow. I used to work at before graduate school. I used to work in an art gallery, and it was kind of this like this secret that like everybody like breaks a painting at least once, or like drops something. Hopefully it's not something too bad. Like I like chipped a frame. I knew a guy who dropped like a $40,000 vase once, but
Jeez. Nope.
um,
Nope.
Well, the worst we had at Gancho Vecchio, unfortunately, is that a student put a pickaxe through a human skull not once but twice because
that's like literally the Arrested Development, because I was gonna
It
bring that
is.
up, like that when they're digging and everyone's like brushing away, and then Buster just smashes through.
it happens. Unfortunately, it does. So, like,
Oh,
yeah.
there was, I mean, one of the another like probably relatable experiences is if you go, particularly I'm thinking like when there's like little local museums sort of all over the Mediterranean, like in places like Italy, and they just have stuff just kind of like hanging out. And I'd be, when I was like a student and things, and we'd be visiting, and then like if people got like my nightmare was I was gonna like turn around and my backpack was gonna like knock a vase off or something like that. And once, I'm trying to remember where we were, but they had this. It was like a fourth century sarcophagus where like the top had kind of broken and you could see inside, and there was like, so like you view it on the ground level, and then there's also a balcony you go up to like look down. You can look inside the sarcophagus and see the bones. And one of the students in my class with me, she like dropped her like basically her like clipboard,
Oh my gosh.
and it like missed the sarcophagus by like an inch, but like some papers flew out, and like you could feel like everybody hold their breath as the piece of paper like wafted down, and I was like, we were all like afraid because like, is it gonna go in the hole like with the skeletons? Oh.
Oh yeah.
Our professor told us the worst thing that he ever saw was actually in Rome at the Museum of Roman Civilization, where they have that giant model that Eli and I were actually just talking about in
Yeah.
our
Yeah.
Quo
Yeah.
Vadis
Yeah.
episode that I still need to edit. But a professor told us one of the students once like dropped a binder or something like onto the model and like squished a whole section of Rome.
Oh my gosh.
Oh no.
That's not good. Yeah. Best kept secret is that bad things happen and sometimes you can't stop it.
Yeah, archaeology is a destructive discipline, and sometimes more so than others. So
Yeah.
That actually, I want to like actually come back to that in a second, because I had questions about the current state of this site and like sites in general. But for just a like my first sort of question is, well, no, there's a couple of things. So this, I don't even know where I want to begin. Because yeah, let's get on like just the feels about archaeology. Because like this movie has a lot of like particularly from Basil as the character that kind of like he does a lot of like why we do this moment, but then also like framed against Edith Perry, who's she's sort of thinking about all this in relationship to her own sort of impending, like she's sort of mortally like she's unwell, she's going to die very soon, so she's kind of thinking about like being buried or being dug up, or like legacy and history and things like that. So I wonder, yeah, what do you guys thought about that?
yeah, I think one of the big struggles that Edith's character has is, she's questioning, and this is something archaeologists deal with no matter where they go, is kind of cultural ideas of respecting the dead, because she keeps bringing up, it's like, this is someone's graveyard. This is, what would that individual have wanted people thousands of years later to dig them up? My mom is, once she knew the field I was in, she has made a point of telling me, she's like, I'm going to be cremated. There's not going to be some archaeologists years from now, like digging up my body and coming up
Yeah.
with some weird conclusions. And, when you're actually dealing with your own mortality and trying to think of what kind of legacy you leave behind. You know, she's kind of rich, and so she gets to leave this legacy behind of all of this stuff was found on my property, so it's going to the British Museum. And that's kind of a cool way to be remembered, but
Hmm.
so many people don't have that, and how we remember them, they're usually nameless, but their actual physical remains or their material culture they leave behind, we get to know them again. That's why I like that quote, we're digging to meet the dead, because that is really what we're doing.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the sort of, I guess, overarching theme of just mortality. Because even before they like really dig into the first or second mound, it's like we see Edith going to her husband's grave.
Hmm.
And there is this sort of, I guess, fragility of life with the sort of overhanging war or impending, violence,
Hmm.
and mortality coming in. And so I really appreciated this sort of, at least the perspective of the characters, at least sort of thinking about themselves in sort of digging up the past and seeing themselves in someone else's graveyard, as Basil says it at one point. And I think that so many times archaeology movies, I'm thinking Indiana Jones, don't have that connection.
Yeah, like a skeleton will pop out and you will just like pick
Exactly.
it up and like chuck it. It's just like it's a gag thing
Yeah,
when like the
like the
skeleton pops out
beginning
and
of The
somebody screams.
Mummy, yeah, when, like, the skeleton
Hmm.
pops up. So I think there's so much respect for the material in this movie in a way that really reflects how real archaeologists try very hard to respect the material, especially when we deal with cemeteries or graves that we were either planning to encounter or did not plan to encounter, and sort of bringing all of that respect always in our work.
Hmm.
So I really, really liked that.
Yeah. And I really like, for me, like that it was maybe maudlin or melodramatic, but I did really enjoy the scene sort of towards the end where they bring Edith out and put her in the ship, and the son kind of narrates his
Yeah.
sci-fi story, and they kind of have like almost a recreation of the bear. I mean, it's like not a recreation, but they're like giving her a sort of Viking funeral in a sense, where he sort of describes like the queen flying off on her spaceship, and I mean that was like tugging at my tear
For
ducts.
sure.
Yeah, but like part of, I think I was watching Tracy and then she was kind of like, "What are you doing to the site? What are you just like walking around there? Like, what's going on?"
Yeah, I was gonna say
Go
my
for it.
favorite part about that scene with Robert, I think was his
Yeah.
son's name,
Hmm.
is I think it's a subtle nod to the fact that a lot of these burials are actually being recognized that they were for women who were also
Hmm.
warriors, because there's this old tradition of anytime you get a burial that has a sword and shield in it, they
Yep.
wouldn't
It's a
even,
dude.
yeah, they would assume it was a, and it's really easy to sex a skeleton. Like, I'm not 100% sure, but you don't need DNA analysis to like figure out if it was male or female most of the time.
Hmm.
So I loved his story, his narration at the end there, of just imagining the fact that this could be for a woman, because archaeologists did not do that for a long time.
Yeah, and
It's
then
true.
counter, it's like if you find a comb in it, like it's or a hairbrush or a mirror or something like that, it would have, yeah. Even
Exactly.
though like it's not unreasonable for someone to be buried with a sword, to be buried with a comb or a sword or whatever. But let's actually talk about like, because I've heard of the Sutton Hoo, the site that this is, but I have a tendency to confuse it with a lot of sort of similar digs. Like I think there was a Viking ship in like Sweden or Norway, it's kind of similar. And then there's other. It seems like every couple of years in England, like a farmer kind of like digs, like is plowing his field and he digs up like a coin hoard or like a bunch of swords or something like that. But yeah, let's talk about like Sutton Hoo proper. Like what's the deal with the site, and like why was it such a big deal?
I think I think today we don't really realize how big of a deal it was, but like the Sutton Hoo helmet, like that
Hmm.
image is on like so many history books and is so,
Editions of Beowulf.
yeah, exactly. It's on so many different things and we really don't think about where it came from. And this is obviously like a little bit out, I would say a lot of it out of my like expertise range, but it's such a huge piece of history because it sort of proved how far reaching a lot of trade routes could go because of all the various materials that were found inside these mounds.
Hmm.
And I think there was like Byzantine gold in that mound that they dug up. All of that gold came from really far away. And so I remember what was the dick archaeology guy who came in from the British
Oh,
Museum?
Phillips,
Phillips.
C.W.
Yeah,
Phillips. Yeah.
he at one point says, like, they had culture or something stupid
Yeah,
like
he kind of
that.
like sums it up in like a single speech where he's like, "Oh, it's a Merovingian tremesis." I turned on the subtitles because I was watching. I'm like, "Did he say Merovingian?" I had to like rewind and put on the subtitles.
Mhm.
It's a Merovingian tremesis, which means that this dates this to like the 6th century, which otherwise is we have nothing basically. We're not nothing, but we have like next to nothing from that sort of period in history.
And so, yeah, the assumption, yeah, is like when you have nothing, you sort of think,
Mm-hmm.
oh, backwater, like stupid. There's all these really bad connotations that you can throw at.
Everyone's just rolling around in mud huts or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly. And so, just the fact that I guess you give more attention when you think things are quote unquote cultured, which I think is a terrible way to put that. It's obvious that they were far-ranging traders or that they could get material from very far away. They had connections to people very far away, and so I hate the word cultured, but experienced, I guess, this group of people who lived here, and so it sort of sheds more of a light onto something that had previously been called a backwater.
Yeah, kind of going off what Elijah was saying, with especially that quote by Phillips, it you kind of need to understand where the field of archaeology was in that moment to really understand why he was so excited. It's like these weren't just some marauding pirates. It's like they had money, they had culture. Like I like it's like, oh yeah, they were rich on top of everything else. So Sutton Hoo is a 7th century Anglo-Saxon burial ship, all of those mounds. But the time it's being dug in 1939, this is kind of when we're at the height of what we call cultural historical archaeology. And at that time, there's a lot of emphasis on defining historical societies into these distinct ethnic and cultural groupings according to their material culture. But at the same time, that was influenced by kind of nationalist political agendas. So if you are growing up in England, you know about Sutton Hoo, you learned about it in elementary school because that is like your first instance of like, oh, we were this cultured such a long
Mm-hmm.
time ago. Greece has kind of the same thing where the Athenian Acropolis was occupied for thousands of years, but if you visit today, you will see the Acropolis of the 5th century BCE because that's when democracy was born. That's when Athens
Mm-hmm.
was on top. And that is the history they want to highlight as like their golden age almost. And Sutton Hoo kind of really fit into this of like an early
Yeah.
golden age to legitimize Britain as an international power going to this far back date.
Yeah, well, this reminds me. I mean, like the most sort of like strongest example is Mussolini and like fascist Italy had this whole. I mean, they built the Museum of Roman Civilization that's designed in this like fascist. It's fascist architecture, but it's evocative of classical sort of Greco-Roman architecture. The whole when you go to Rome today, that the Via de Fora Imperiale, the sort of big road. There was an act, that goes up to the Colosseum with this vista, and then they actively decided like we're going to dig down to I think it was like 1st or 2nd century, like Augustan era forum, something like that. And they left all the temples standing now, they're all like 4th century or later, right?
Yeah.
But this idea of like we're gonna pick a moment that when we were sort of when our sort of cultural legacy, or as we're construing it, was having its moment, and kind of say like this is why we deserve to be empire or whatever. And like tons of nations and regimes, I'm thinking very odd, like Russia. And our colleague Susan
Mhm.
is very into like Russian search for various sort of cultural historical legitimacy, for lack of a better word. Yeah, it's because it plays into like nationalistic kind of.
Well, even Washington, D.C., that's all
Mm-hmm,
Greco-Roman architecture with
mm-hmm.
like, but it's like, but we need to make it American, so corn will be on the, will be a decorative feature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I do think it's interesting though that this story is about British people sort of excavating basically like British history. And I wonder how different the story would be if it had that very imperialist bent of British people excavating Egyptian history.
I had a note like exactly to this point, because like the difference of excavating in a place like England versus say Egypt was actually or Greece, or
Yeah.
Greece at the time, or wherever, or North America.
Exactly. Yeah, because I feel like they have such a connection, and it's kind of wonderful to see that connection of the people in the film to literally the history that's in their own backyard. And like Edith Pretty owned the land that these were on, so there was no like trespassing or necessarily like stealing happening. And I do think that it would have been a much more problematic story to tell something happening in Greece in the 30s, or even at
Hmm.
Pompeii. Like the early excavations in Pompeii were a little bit dicey. And especially in Egypt, when they're just, are taking stuff out by the shipful. Even
Hmm.
earlier, Napoleon was taken out stuff by the shipful. So
Yeah.
I think that sort of cut out something that could have been really problematic in the story, for better or worse, I guess.
Yeah.
I love though how in the end, so like Hitler is literally name dropped in this movie, and you have that tension of like World War II looming in the background, but like the true villain of this entire movie is the British Museum, like the whole time.
True.
And I'm
Yeah.
so mad at the British Museum, even though like for once it's like, but this is actually like British cultural history. And Edith's decision at the very end to to give all of the
Hmm.
artifacts to the British Museum,
It's the
it
largest gift at the time or something
the
like
largest
that.
gift, and her reasoning for it was she wanted the material to be seen by the most people possible. She wanted it to be accessible, and that's why she didn't go with the local museum. She went with the British Museum, and this is kind of the argument the British Museum has been trying to make for keeping the
Elgin
cultural
marbles,
heritage of,
or
yeah.
the Acropolis, I should say. Actually,
Yep,
I
the
gotta not.
Acropolis marbles, the Rosetta Stone,
Hmm.
African
Hmm.
artifacts. And their idea is like, and I've been to the British Museum. It's free. You can go in, and like maybe you could keep that argument. And then Brexit happened. So they're like, there is no legitimate reason why the British Museum should get to hold on to all of this material culture. Especially, like, we really should revisit this issue because the ability to put everything online and do virtual exhibits, like
Mhm.
Hmm.
accessibility is no longer the issue. We really should be looking into where does this material rightfully belong.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, that was one of my, I think, first, like when I took sort of like like for like a better, like a sort of in my like introduction to like archaeology and cultural history. I think we were specifically talking about a site in Sicily, I think, that sort of prompted this. But yeah, that's a I mean, you two know more obviously about this, or are more sort of hands on, but like when you have a site, do you set up, say, a museum right there? Do you take everything out to sort of a place like the British Museum or the Met in New York, which I also had? I spent a lot of time going to the Met and like thinking of like Temple of Dender, and just like they have so much Egyptology. There was a whole snafu, I think, with the Met, and they have like an Etruscan chariot that
Mhm.
the provenance of that one
Yup.
is I think a little dicey. And yeah, and like that argument gets wheeled out constantly. It's like, well, like should we take it? We should take it to the place where the most people are going to see it and appreciate it. Or, but then there's also like I think like local consideration. Like if you have a very prominent site, that could do a lot for a local community. I mean, double edged sword too. If you want, like maybe you don't want to bring international tourists to your little village or whatever, but
For a lot of these places, that's like archaeology is commercialized, and I would rather it be commercialized in a way that it does bring, local income to local communities. So the site that Elijah and I met at, Ganji Vecchio, the nearby town of Ganji, has its own museum. All of the artifacts, they never come to the United States. They stay local and they get presented in that museum space. And they get international visitors, which is really because they're also, this is the same town that is one of the same towns that is selling housing for €1 because
Yeah, I forgot
so
about
mm,
that.
many
yeah.
people are leaving that they
Hmm.
are desperate to get people to come and stay and spend money. So if we want archaeology to actually continue to prosper, I think it's really important that we keep artifacts local to where they come from so that more resources, more income, and visitors go to where the artifacts are. Otherwise, only huge universities with tons of money and museums are going to have control over these sites and what people get to see in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, and then there's also another this movie, I think, probably, yeah, I think intentionally, I would say, but there's like another element that is, you mentioned the specter of World War II, and then when they were debating, sort of, they had that argument about which, does it go to Ipswich, does it go to London, and because you kind of, I got the sense for a while that Edith Perry, or Pretty, excuse me, not Perry, was considering leaning more towards the local museum, because she says something to the effect of like, well, isn't London about to get blitzed?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And the element of some of like things like this happens all the time, particularly in parts of the Mediterranean where sort of conflict and war, arises, and then that adds this other wrench into that equation of a site. Like I'm thinking of Palmyra is like probably the most famous recent example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where it's, local turmoil and conflict like puts these sites at risk.
Yeah, even Olympia, their museum site, I think they had lost so many resources due to the economic difficulties of that country that they only had one security guard on duty, and the museum got sacked. And that was a local, well-known site and museum, but the local resources aren't there always to protect these things.
Yeah. I mean, famously, it's
yeah,
old news, but yeah, famously the Parthenon, was blown up because they were storing gunpowder in it.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, that leads me to another question I had, because one of the first, like right in the beginning, he's debating, Basil Brown is sort of debating which mound to dig into. He says, "Well, there's a little depression in this mound." Because she's like, let's start. Like, you think we should start with the big one? And he's like, well, it looks like somebody already dug here, so I suspect that grave robbers came through. So let's dig at this other mound, because like if there's anything good in this first mound, then they might have already gotten to it. So yeah, but it's like the other reality of digging is looting, because I mean, in many times these places have been left pretty much just unguarded. They're just hanging out, and people like, and like grave robbing is like how we find. I'm thinking of like Pompeii, which like the first couple of decades of Pompeii was just people digging down and finding the best stuff, and then tossing the rest, and then selling it to like the Bourbon Kings of Spain or whatever.
Yeah, and I think people may not realize how big of a problem it still is. It sort of sounds like one of those old school, otherworldly, or even like Indiana Jonesy kind of things. But the black market for things like ancient coins is like very, very much alive and well, and doing a lot of damage to sites that aren't super popular, aren't like sort of near big touristy sites. A lot of Roman coins come out of places like Bulgaria or other places in Eastern Europe that just don't have as much access or funding to actually dig through their whole site. But people know those things are there. And so you have people going in and just digging a hole and taking what they can, and it ends up on eBay.
Mm-hmm. Or Etsy.
Or Etsy, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Which is wild.
You can buy Roman glass earrings off of Etsy, and
whoa,
it's not okay. Yeah. So anytime you buy a Roman coin, it is problematic. Don't do it.
Yeah. I remember we had a few years ago, we had a guest lecturer at UT, and she was like leading a project that had to do with the busts at Palmyra. Like they had this big sort of like, what's the word, like mausoleum, I guess, and all these hundreds of busts of like local and Roman nobility, and it was really interesting because like just even from the naming scheme and the cultural, like talking about like cultural sort of synergy is the dumb word, but there's a better word I'm looking for, but the sort of, yeah, just cultural contact between like Roman and like Near Eastern. But then there's this whole like market like for busts, and also correspondingly copies, forgeries, that's the word I'm looking for, and like how to spot a fake and things like that,
which is really interesting.
And taken to the extreme, the conflict in Syria, ISIS was fully funding a lot of their military campaigns by looting ancient sites and selling them on the black market. So like, yeah, again, just like the commercialization of archaeology, there's really positive ways to do it, but the fact that people like to put a price on objects and have it for private collections makes it really, and we lose so much information about the past every time an artifact is taken out of the ground, out of context, which is the other reason I hate the British Museum, because if you go look at their Roman stuff, I'll see a lamp and I'm like, oh, that's an exact copy of like a lamp we see at Ganjavecchio. Where's it from? Maybe Naples.
There was a scene, I think, when they found one of the first whatever it was they found. I think it was like one of the first like jewelry pieces or something like that, or maybe it was like a rivet. And somebody, I forget who finds it first, but then they kind of pick it up and they're looking at it. And I was kind of like tensing up, and I was grabbing Tracy next to me. I was like, write that down, write it down, like don't just take it out.
That was actually that's one of the moments that actually, if you're an archaeologist, you kind of know that moment of like, I just found something really cool, and now that I've taken a picture and done a total station shot, I'm gonna pick it up and run it over to the director of the dig and be like, look at this cool thing I found. Like, so every time he's going to the house being like, you should come see this, you should come see this, I'm like, yeah, that's real.
And like later you get like, I think like some good establishing shots where you see them like kind of brushing it away and being sort of very meticulous, because I don't like, I'm not sure actually. I had a quick question about just like the develop, like when that kind of very systematic handling kind of archaeology like begins, and then like how it has changed or hasn't changed.
That's harder to say, I think. I do know, like, fun thing I researched about the movie beforehand was that for this movie, they actually consulted an archaeologist by the name of Roy Stevenson, and they gave him like carte blanche rights to interrupt filming if they were doing any kind of incorrect digging. So I thought
that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and like that's what made it feel so authentic in a lot of ways. In terms of, when does it become systematic? I think a lot of that happens at Pompeii. Pompeii really starts off with a lot of looting, but then see if I remember.
I think I know what you're talking about, but his name is
Fiorelli. I think it's like Fiorelli he's the one who came up with the idea for like making plaster cast of the hollows for the human remain, or they weren't really remains anymore, but
the echoes of people.
Yeah. And so I think it was just a lot of that was individuals who, like Basil, who have been digging for a long time. They kind of developed their own methodology. And that is what's cool, like especially in the Middle East and Egypt, you definitely had these individuals who were always just kind of the hired local work hands, but because that was a constant source of income, they became specialists in their own right and would eventually, if they got enough resources, they would lead their own digs. And so archaeology is still a lot of this. Like my small finds toolkit is a combination of like a trowel is used for construction. My small finds kit is actually mostly tools that you would use for ceramics, like actually
like laying brick or something like that.
For like actually like working on a pottery wheel. So I have tools like that. It's a pretty, in some ways, it's really a makeshift field of like, all right, what works? Paintbrushes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, actually, that I had my other one of my other comments was just like we should talk about Basil Brown himself and the idea, because he I mean they set him up that he's this kind of like, I don't want to say amateur. He's not an amateur because this is his profession. Like he does it, but he's not like a full-time academic. Like he's not PhD, or he doesn't have like a faculty position or anything like that, or a museum. He's just kind of this hired gun, for lack of a better word. But he had quite a bit of experience. I like was just tracking him down on Wikipedia, and that he in his spare time he investigated sort of Suffolk area. He found, using a compass and measurements, he uncovered 8 medieval buildings and Roman settlements and ancient roads. So he wasn't like, this wasn't like just some guy. Like he knew what he was about.
Yeah, and I think that was also just a really good, like, this is an issue that still exists in archaeology today. Like those who have an academic degree and those who are just involved in digs. Like so much of the labor is either local or students, but they somehow are not credited for not only the work, but they also offer insights, interpretation, especially if they're local.
There's also, I've heard creepy stories of directors or doctors or whatever, just like straight up plagiarizing from like, say, their grad students or younger female colleagues, things like that definitely happens.
Yeah, it's a weird old boys club. And another thing they got right in the movie was like, all right, we're done digging, to the pub, let's go drinking, because it really is kind of it has this history of being kind of a fraternity of sorts. So you have, so if you're not part of the in crowd, you get left out of a lot of the credit and everything.
Yeah. I saw that it's so much in Poor Peggy in the movie. Who was that? Lily James. That's right.
Yeah.
When they just bring her in because, oh, she's light, so she won't like crush the
Mhm.
the ship underneath
Yeah.
her, and poor thing's like digging in a dress for like the first two scenes or something. It's like, oh, come on. This poor girl.
Yeah. She's one. I mean, so obviously, like the movie takes like, or the book it's based on, really, but then the movie like takes some like liberties with the plot. Like I think it condenses the digging. It was actually 2 seasons, but they kind of make it one.
Mhm.
Things like that. And like that romantic subplot is
Right.
purely just for audience engagement. But yeah, because I think in real life, Peggy Piggott, she was actually, not only was her husband like actually more close to her, like they have her seem like her husband's like 20 years older than her or something, but they were like only like 2 or 3 years apart. But she had a degree, she had a couple degrees and had like pretty extensive experience, so she was brought in on her credentials originally.
Mhm.
But that's also like,
That was kind of my thought with Edith at the very beginning, before you knew she was sick, because she's like, oh yeah, my dad had me come and dig up the apse of a church, I think. And like at the very beginning, I was like, why aren't you like in there with Basil digging stuff? I would be there in a heartbeat. And
Right.
yeah.
then you learn she's sick, but it's women were present in the field at that time. So like having Peggy there and her being a real historical figure was really cool. And it was
I'm like blanking right now, but there's a whole kind of tribute in damn, there's a whole book in like the American School of Classical Studies in Athens. Yeah, where of the sort of early, like on the ground level of like excavating at the Agora were some very prominent women that were like instrumental in the development and the reason the site looks the way it does. And then like true to form, it's only sort of in recent years where many of them are sort of getting sort of their due credit.
yeah, a really good site to learn about women's contributions to archaeology is called the Trailblazers. So if you ever want to learn more about women in archaeology, and maybe in some other anthropology fields as well, like bioarchaeology, like that's a great place to start. And the other shout out, and like became my personal like favorite character almost, was May, the wife of Basil, because she was the ultimate supportive archaeologist partner.
Yeah.
And her, like, their relationship I thought was going to start off so poorly because like it's like, you didn't read my letters, you didn't know it was coming. I'm like, oh, this is going to be so awkward the whole time. But it was like, no, she's the one who's like, I know you're doing what you love. Sometimes I have to remind you why why are we living on rent? Your terrible pay
Yeah,
every year.
she kind of confounded me at first as sort of a character. I didn't quite know what to make of like what direction. Whereas like in contrast with Peggy, like the minute we see Peggy's husband with his colleague, we kind of like, I see what's up.
Yeah.
But then with May, like I was like, I didn't know where that was going, because it was like, is he just this like bad husband? But then she really comes through in ways where she's the one that convinces him to go back, and it's kind of, she's like, yeah, like you said, like very, very supportive.
And I think that's what's the funny thing about our field. I know Elijah can speak to this too, where like we leave our partners for months at a time for other parts of the world. And, that's not always possible without a supportive partner who's, first of all, okay with you globetrotting,
Yeah.
being able to financially support you, and so, or like, pay the rent while you're gone and that sort of thing. So it started off awkward, but it was also just like a really clear reminder of like, it does take a special person to be supportive of this field. You're like, it is pretty common, like either both partners are archaeologists themselves working in the field together, or one just is very supportive about what you do.
It's true.
My outsider impression is that a lot of archaeologists meet their partners at these digs. I know of at least more than a few where that was the case.
Yes.
Deny if this is wrong, but it becomes a little bit of like the Love Boat sometimes.
Oh yeah.
It's summer camp. Yeah, it's summer camp.
Summer love, yep, summer fling.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, you take a bunch of young, attractive people, you put them in the hot weather, and then you go to the bars afterwards. It's just like,
Exactly.
it's easy math.
It is like the crucible of human relationships, any kind of excavation season, because you'll either come out loving people or absolutely hating their guts. So like, I thought it was really, it's like you definitely got that, and then the person you absolutely
name some
hated,
names. No, I'm just kidding.
I hated Phillips. Phillips in the movie is like, you are that guy that like everyone hates but has to put up with, because what other choice is there?
Yep.
My other, like, I've listeners and both of you, of course, already knows I'm not an archaeologist. I'm sort of I'm too precious. But that like, in my just like the way I describe it, particularly like the field of classics, where it tends to have a sort of divide between sort of the literary people and the material culture people, a bit of a false dichotomy, but that's neither here nor there, or I think it is. But is that like, it's almost the way I describe it sometimes is that it's like if you see Scrubs and they have like the medical doctors and the surgeons are like the jocks on campus, and then the medical doctors are like these dweebs. It's kind of like that in classics, where it's like
Yep.
the literature people are like the ones like, we need to wear eye protectors when we eat grapefruit, and then the archaeologists are kind of they're just much more gregarious. Again, I'm speaking in hugely general terms. I've met some weirdos and on both sides, but
I have a particular story from a dig in Greece that I was at on island of Crete, and there was one student there who was a philologist, and we had to like get on trucks to go up to this mountaintop and then hike the rest of the way to the dig. So we had to carry the water we were going to use for the day with us, and so we had these giant jugs. And then some of us would figure out like we could get plastic water bottles and freeze them in our little hotel fridges overnight. So where it's at the end of the day, this philologist guy who is kind of weird has a jug of hot water because it's been sitting in the sun all day. And one of my trench mates, Alex, has just a chunk of ice in his bottle. And he asks this kid, it's like, hey, why don't you pour your water into my jug? And that way we can share it. So it's like cold water. And this guy just looked at him and literally went, germs. And I'm like, you literally have been digging in dirt all day with goat poop, and you're worried about germs?
He saw COVID-19 before any of us. No.
Yeah. Yes. In modern times, I would buy it, but in 2012,
yeah.
I'm like, what?
Yeah, that tracks.
Yeah, I loved the scenes of Basil just like washing his hands, and it's like all this dirt is just sort of coming off of him, and it's like in his fingernails. And I'm like, yep, that's accurate.
Yeah, or the scene where the wall collapses on him and he's like, like buried alive, basically.
That has happened to me on a much less scary scale. The first time I worked in the field, I was in the Netherlands. We were digging up medieval garbage pits. And so they're like, they look like a well. It's ringed in brick, and we sort of dig down, and it's garbage. So it's our favorite thing ever. Archaeologists love ancient garbage. And it was a construction site because we were in the middle of a city. So we all had to have like hard hats and steel-toed boots and all that stuff. And the side of the wall of the pit that I was in collapsed, and it like filled it all the way up to the top of my thighs. And so I wasn't covered or buried alive.
Yeah, like you could breathe.
I could breathe. But it was kind of a scary moment, and I had bruises on my legs, and they had to dig me out. Like if it had been any higher, I think it would have probably hurt a lot more. But so yeah, that's why we do things like only dig holes to certain depths until you have like a step out. Why you have to wear hard hats in certain situations. Why you have to wear steel-toed boots in certain situations. Yeah, we have safety precautions now, but for good reason.
I was wondering because it's like that happened, and I was just like, that has never happened to me. That is not.
He did have a precariously high dirt wall.
They did.
I feel like he should have known better, but.
And apparently that was added to the movie. It was either added to the movie or the book. Like it didn't actually happen at Sutton Hoo. Not to say like obviously collapses can happen, but like it hadn't happened there, and they felt like it. I mean, to be fair, digging. If you watch digging happening hour by hour, not a lot is happening. It's not thrilling. So having an entire wall collapse down, you're like, drama, danger.
They also needed like some kind of like, it's sort of like a narrative function too, because like it was when the collapse happens, that's when he realizes, I forget exactly the logic, but that's when he realizes that he should be digging the first mound, right?
Yeah.
I forget why though.
Yeah, I think it's It's actually tied to that first board they found, because what that board actually was, it wasn't wood like they originally thought. It was compacted sand that had taken on the mold of the wood. And so that changed his idea of the dates for the mounds to push it back to the Anglo-Saxon period.
Mm-hmm.
And with that consideration, knowing how old the mounds could be, that's why he wanted to revisit the other one.
Because like the shape was probably different, and so maybe the robbers hadn't hit the center.
Yeah, because like the actual ship is really more like a footprint of a ship, because it was like they buried the ship, and then the wood disintegrated over time, but the sand was compacted and chemically changed it enough that when they excavated it, and all like any like metal like rivets and stuff were still there, so like they had basically a perfect outline of the ship, and they could see where the planks were and the rivets and all that stuff.
Yeah,
which is pretty cool.
It is really cool.
Which is like the most anxiety I had for that entire film was not when the wall collapsed on him, because like to me it's like, I mean, yeah, it's scary, but it's like that doesn't seem realistic to me. Every time it was downpouring rain.
Yes,
because I've had that happen to a site where you have to bucket it out, and there was like human remains exposed, and you're like, no.
I had a note that I wrote to myself that it just seems like excavating in England must be a nightmare, because it just rains once a day, or at least once a day.
Yes.
Where like if you're excavating in like, North Africa or the Middle East or a place like that, or even like Greece and Italy, like in the summer it's pretty dry usually.
Yeah, I actually I had students ask me once, it's like, what kind of conditions would I want to dig in? Because we were talking about how organic materials can be preserved in either really arid or really waterlogged conditions. And I was just like, all I know is I do not want to dig in mud. That sounds miserable, and I want nothing to do with it. So I imagine that's a lot of what digging at Sutton Hoo was like. So
yeah.
I know, at least for places like in Iowa, you like if it's too muddy, you don't dig. Like if it's raining and still waterlogged, like you just can't. Like you can't get the right precision that you need. You can't even move that amount of dirt that's weighted down with water, and so it just holds up even more time. So yeah, I can't imagine digging through mud.
It's a weird balance that archaeologists have to deal with, because most projects are on a limited timeline because you only have so much money and resources available to you. So yeah, if it rains, and it happens rarely in Sicily, but if it rains, we kind of have to shut down for a day, and losing a day of digging is like heartbreaking, because it just you might not get to it. I think our last season at Gonjavecchio, we got to a dog burial on the like second to last day of the dig, and it's like we literally just have to like rebury it now because there's no time to do this.
That's also like the curse. Like you always find the coolest thing on the like third to last day, right?
Yep. Oh yeah.
Yep. And the whole backfilling scene as the credits were about to roll, I like felt that deep in my soul.
I hate backfill day. It's such a pain.
I am curious though, Colin, as a non-archaeologist, do you think you have like as many feelings about this movie? Did you enjoy this movie as much as we did?
I enjoyed it like as on a movie level, like purely for like a narrative, like emotional, like it hit all of like, it had a plot that I followed, and it had characters that I was invested in, and like everything checked off. I don't have that same kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like connection, like because I have not sort of dug in, I've been to archaeological sites, and I'm like aware of the general sense, but it's all secondhand. But yeah, did it make me want to? I will say like I had a moment. This is the story. I had a moment where I like maybe I missed my true calling, because when I was in Greece and they took us down to the Agora basement, and they have where they keep like, and I'm not exaggerating, they have exactly 1 gajillion vases down there. That's just like, it's so many that we don't even know what to do with them, because it's just like, here's another red figureware. We have like 800 of these already. So like they have this massive storage, but they also have a huge deposit, and they're constantly digging up more of just like ostraca and like pot shards. But they sat me down at like this table and they gave me like more or less like some guides and a bucket full of pot shards, and I sat there and I joined for like an hour, and I was like, maybe I missed my true calling, because like it was some kind of like my little like years of Legos paid off, and I was like, just sit me down here with like some music and a podcast and I could do this all day. Like, no, like there's a great deal of satisfaction I get from just like making joins, and then like, haha, it's a pot, and then looking at it against the guide and being like, late 4th century or something. And then I remember the director, she was like, you're pretty good at this. And I was like, yes, I am. But I've already done my prospectus, so I can't change my dissertation now. But like, I wonder sometimes if maybe I like, because there's a certain, like, I love process. Like, if you ever see me pack the dishwasher, I'm a very like precise and particular person. So there's like a certain element of it, like 100% appeals to me.
Yeah, the tedious work that never is going to make it onto a film of just piecing together a piece of pot or the
Counting bricks.
Yeah, counting bricks, color, figuring out the color of the soil. I will say that was the other cool thing about Basil as the character, when he talks about like, I don't know if I agree with the whole the nose is the most important like body part of an archaeologist.
What is the most important organ an archaeologist can possess?
I definitely think of a thing like reading the dirt. Like if you spend a lot of time in the field, you learn, especially using your cello. I think feeling is a really significant part of it, where you just start to see and feel soil changes. Like you can almost feel the change happening, and it's like that means a whole new time period or a new process it's an added layer to the story. So like that sense of like knowing all the soils of Suffolk and like where they came from, like that is a real thing when you've spent so much time with dirt. I imagine some geologists could probably really speak to this too, of really having a sense of place and time.
They set this up too, because like this is, I think, maybe few people, particularly now, where in my experience, like a lot of archaeologists tend not necessarily jet set, but like you travel and move and are sort of relocated in different contexts. But like he literally was tooling around Suffolk, like just Suffolk, for however many, for decades it seemed like, and he was like an expert, and like just to have that kind of time to just like know of one sort of sliver of the world, but like know it so intimately the way he did.
Yeah, and I think that's why like local archaeologists and local even just like excavators are so important, because if you are new to a site and you don't necessarily know the soil as well, you might be able to say, okay, I know there's a change happening here, but I'm not sure which like direction it's going, or I'm not sure where to follow it. The excavators will absolutely be like, oh, well, that's probably goes this way, or like, I know what's happening here, and they're definitely the voices of reason in moments like that.
Yeah, the funny thing is I've dug in a few different places, and once you become an academic, like they start asking you, it's like, what's your research specialty? And I'm always like, I specialize in parcel 19 of Gangia Vecchia, Sicily, of this particular date and time. Please don't ask me about any other site in extensive detail, because until I've spent like 4 seasons digging it, I don't know for sure.
So this maybe might be my send-off question to you too, which is, I guess 2 questions I just thought of. One is favorite place you've ever dug, and then 2, place you would most like to dig if, given unlimited time and resources and no global pandemic or whatever.
Oh my God, this is such a hard question. Christy, do you have anything? I'm still thinking.
I mean, I love Gangia Vecchio a lot, but I think my favorite place I ever dug was at Azoria in Crete, just because the view was breathtaking. We're digging a site on top of a hill not too far from the coastline, so you can see the Mediterranean Sea just off in the distance. And like, I had terrible trenches. Like, the Hellenistic people like literally took out everything that existed before it. So we'd get through the Hellenistic floor and then there was nothing left. But in terms of like the experience of being somewhere and working, like that was really cool. Like I said, I didn't really get to find anything, but I think the season I was there, they found the oldest imported marble that had been found on the island at that point in time.
Wild.
So yeah, it was cool. It was a really great experience. And then for my bucket list, I do have a bucket list. I would love to dig at one of the sites mentioned in the Iliad. So either Hisarlik, Troy in Turkey, or go to Mycenae because I've had some friends to get Mycenae. That looks really fun.
That would be Mycenae would be dope.
That would be so dope.
I've been there. It's real cool. There's a lot of like just funky stuff going on. Get into like the tomb. The tombs were my favorite. I mean, like the fort and everything is so cool, but like the tombs were my favorite. It's very like. What about you, Eli? What do you got?
I think,
and I have a follow-up question, which is coolest thing you've ever found. But
okay, I think I loved working at Himera in Sicily. We didn't technically dig there. We were doing bioarchaeological analysis of human remains from the huge rescue excavations that they were doing as they were building a new railway. And I think it would be so cool to actually be able to dig the town at Himera, because they haven't done huge excavations there, at least on like the top of the plateau. It has like an upper city and a lower city, and the lower city is where all the cemeteries were. And then that is also right on the Mediterranean Sea. It's on the north coast of Sicily. And I would love to be able to sort of dig the actual city and see the places where all of these people lived and existed, all these people that I've sort of, encountered by analyzing their remains. So I think that would be crazy awesome. I don't know if I have the coolest thing I've ever found.
I mean, Christie said dog burial. That sounds pretty cool.
Archaeologists have a really hard time with this question. I will say that the one thing that when I find it that always feels really amazing is when you get a piece of pottery that has someone's fingerprint on it. Like, that to me is such an amazing moment, because like that person, there'll never be a written history about that person, but there's such a tangible piece of evidence that they lived and produced things that still exist in the world today, and like kind of immortality in a nutshell. So every time I see a fingerprint,
that's like the theme of this movie. That's like we've come full circle.
Yeah, so true. Yeah, I like that too. That's pretty cool.
All right. Well, unless you guys have, we're a little over an hour, which is our usual sort of time. Unless you guys have any parting thoughts.
I'm glad we could do like a new movie. This was fun to talk about.
Yeah, and Christie, for everyone, if people are listening, where can they find you on the interwebs?
So that's a good question. I should have technically I am on Twitter and on Instagram, I think under the handles Vogue Archaeology or Professor Vogue Archaeology. I'm also on the University of Lynchburg website as part of their faculty. But if I'm on here again sometime, I will have a clearer answer on those.
No, for sure. I definitely want to have you back at some point in the future to talk about Hades.
Yeah.
That'd be, and Angie too, that'd be great.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This was one I might actually front load. I have an episode like from Quo Vadis that I haven't edited yet, but I might actually fast track this one and do this one first, because I think the Quo Vadis one I haven't really listened to it, but it's a little blur.
It was a mess.
But this one's going to be this one's going to be good. So I might front load this one. But anyway, no, thank you so much for having you. We definitely want to have you back. This has been great.
Yay.
I think this is going to be one of our better episodes.
Yeah, awesome. I had a great time.
Yeah. Wait, do we need to do any sort of sign off, or are we good?
Oh, we do. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to edit all around this, but yeah, thank you again, Dr. Christie Vogler. This is fantastic, and you will be a repeat guest. That is for sure.
Yay!
I'm excited. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.